Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the shadows of time. Tonight, let us drift into one of the most enduring mysteries ever whispered across the centuries. Have you ever wondered if somewhere beneath the restless waves of the ocean lies the memory of a civilization so radiant, so advanced, and so tragically lost that its very absence has haunted humanity for millennia? This, my friend, is the story of Atlantis, a legend that is part history, part myth, and entirely irresistible to anyone who has ever gazed at the sea and wondered what secrets it hides. Before we step further, let me gently remind you, if you find these wanderings through the echoes of history comforting, if they ease you towards sleep or simply spark your imagination, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a like if you enjoy the way we travel together through the past, and perhaps write in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. There is something quietly magical about knowing that others in faraway places are drifting into dreams along the same story. So now, let us begin. Imagine yourself wrapped in a blanket, the world outside hushed, and we will set sail. Not on a modern ship, but in the vessel of imagination. The waves lap against our thoughts as we go back, not hundreds, but thousands of years, until we arrive in ancient Greece. You are seated in a shaded courtyard, perhaps among marble columns and the gentle trickle of a fountain. A man of immense wisdom is speaking, his words flowing like a calm river. His name is Plato. You have heard of him, of course. Philosopher, thinker, student of Socrates, teacher of Aristotle, one of the giants whose ideas still shape our world. And tonight, he leans forward, his voice measured, deliberate, almost conspiratorial, as if what he's about to tell you is not meant for everyone, but for those with the patience to listen closely. He tells of a land beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. Far out in the ocean, he says, there once existed an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, a place of astonishing wealth and power. Its people, descended from Poseidon himself, had created a paradise of justice, innovation, and divine order. They called it Atlantis. The very word lingers in the air, carrying a sense of grandeur, as though it contains within it not just the memory of a place, but the ache of its loss. But before we go too far, let us pause and appreciate the strangeness of this tale. Plato was no storyteller spinning idle fables. His dialogues were philosophical works intended to probe the very essence of virtue, society, and the cosmos. And yet, here he was, devoting not just a passing mention, but two of his most famous works, Timaeus and Critias, to the account of a lost civilization. Was he recounting an allegory, a cautionary myth to warn Athens about the dangers of corruption and imperial ambition? Or was he preserving a fragment of truth passed down from Egyptian priests to Solon, his ancestor, and from Solon to him, like an ancient message in a bottle carried across generations? Picture Plato's audience. They sit in quiet fascination as he describes this empire of the sea. At first, the Atlanteans were virtuous, noble, almost godlike in their justice and wisdom. Their city gleamed with white, black, and red stone, quarried from their island. They had mastered hydraulic systems, built concentric rings of canals and bridges that made their capital shimmer like a jewel in the ocean. Their temples were adorned with gold and orichalcum, a mysterious metal said to glow like fire. At the center stood a temple to Poseidon, its roof ivory, its pinnacles gilded, and within it a colossal golden statue of the sea god driving 6-winged horses. It was, by all accounts, a utopia. The kind of society philosophers dream about, where rulers were bound not by greed but by law, and where abundance was shared in harmony. But as Plato's tale continues, the tone shifts. The divine heritage of the Atlanteans begins to thin, diluted by mortal flaws. What had once been justice becomes ambition. What had once been harmony becomes conquest. Their fleets, once symbols of order, turn into engines of imperial expansion. They march against the peoples of the Mediterranean, seeking to subjugate them all, until finally they turn their eyes toward the ancestors of Athens. And here Plato pauses, for the story is not merely about Atlantis. It is about Athens itself, the city he loves, standing as a paragon of virtue resisting the corruption of imperial arrogance. It is a contrast, a mirror, a warning. But as he paints this contrast, he leaves us with a tantalizing claim. Atlantis, once so mighty, was punished by the gods. In a single day and night of misfortune, earthquakes and floods consumed it, and the island vanished beneath the sea. All that remains is the memory, a whisper carried by philosophers, and now by us. As you hear this story, allow your imagination to wander. The courtyard fades. The fountain's trickle becomes the sound of waves. You see in your mind's eye the shining walls of Atlantis, the canals gleaming under a golden sun, the voices of a people who believed themselves invincible. And then you feel the tremor, the first hint of the earth shaking beneath them, the waves beginning to rise, a civilization's hubris, a god's displeasure, and the ocean's cold embrace. Is it myth? Is it memory? That is the mystery we will chase together tonight, not with sails or oars, but with words, following the echoes left by Plato into the labyrinth of history, archaeology, geology, and myth. For Atlantis is more than a place. It is an idea. It is the dream of perfection and the nightmare of loss woven into a single name, Atlantis, the lost world that will not let us go. Plato does not rush you into the deep water. He takes your hand and leads you along the shore, showing you first the outlines of the world he is building, then the inner rooms where his ideas sleep. In the dialogue known as Timaeus, he sets the table with familiar guests, Socrates, Timaeus of Locri, Critias, and Hermocrates, and asks them to imagine the best possible city, a place where justice is not an aspiration but a habit, where citizens are shaped by education as carefully as marble is shaped by a sculptor's chisel. It is in this setting that Critias clears his throat and says he can offer not an invention, but an old story, ancient even in Solon's time, about a war between a virtuous, beautifully ordered Athens and a wealthy, powerful island empire called Atlantis. The claim is beguiling. Solon, the great Athenian statesman and poet, traveled to Egypt and spoke with priests at Sais, a city devoted to Neith, whom the Greeks often equated with Athena. These priests, keepers of records older than Greece itself, told him that the Greeks were like children who forget their past each time fire, flood, or social collapse resets the tally of memory. But in Egypt, where the Nile's rhythm kept calendars steady and stone preserved lists of kings, the story endured. Long before the known Athens, they said, 9,000 years before Solon stood in their halls, there was an older Athens, a city of disciplined citizens, and there was Atlantis, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, rich in metals and timber and elephants, ringed by canals and crowned by temples that gleamed in sunlight as if gilded with the day. The phrase, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, anchors the myth to geography with just enough firmness to tease the mapmaker's mind. Those pillars, commonly taken to mean the straits we call Gibraltar, feel like a hinge where the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic, where the known tips into the unknown. The priests' numbers, too, are a deliberate provocation. 9,000 years. Was Plato being literal, repeating what he heard, or poetic, exaggerating the depth of time to create the moral distance he needed? Some later readers would wonder whether years might have meant months, shrinking the gap to something that could fit more comfortably with Bronze Age timelines. Plato does not pause to adjudicate. He is telling a story in a philosophical frame, and what matters first is the contrast he draws, a disciplined Athens that fights for freedom against an empire whose wealth has softened its virtues into vanity. The details that follow are the kind of luminous fragments that make legends durable. We are told of a capital laid out in rings of land and water, concentric circles joined by bridges, navigable channels that allowed ships to pass from the outer harbors into the city's bright heart. There were hot and cold springs that fed baths for citizens and animals alike, a detail so domestic and specific that it sounds like someone's memory rather than a mythmaker's flourish. The stones used in building, black, white, red, were quarried on the island itself, and the gleam of orichalcum, a mysterious metal treasured as second only to gold, caught the sun along walls and columns so that approaching sailors would have seen an architecture sparkling like a field of wheat in the wind. The rulers of Atlantis, 10 kings descended from the sea god Poseidon by way of a mortal woman named Cleito, governed their territories under laws inscribed on a pillar set in Poseidon's temple. These laws sound almost ceremonial in Plato's telling: regular gatherings, sacrifices, judgments made in the god's presence, the king swearing to preserve the ancestral order. In the beginning, he insists, they did. They were not tyrants then, they were guardians. It is important to notice Plato's craft. He is not simply inventing a glamorous enemy for Athens. He builds Atlantis as a mirror of the ideal city, then mists the glass, showing us what happens when reflection turns into obsession with one's own image. The early Atlanteans live within their limits. They use their wealth for common works, their armies to protect rather than to dominate. Only later, this is the hinge upon which the door of the story swings, do they forget the measure of things. This forgetting is Plato's leitmotif. In dialogue after dialogue, forgetting is the root of disorder. We forget the good. We forget moderation. We forget that power without purpose corrodes the one who wields it. The story of Atlantis lets him dramatize this philosophical truth with the grandeur of a lost continent and the intimacy of a family romance. Divine father, mortal mother, children who inherit gifts they do not know how to keep. We learn, too, of the land itself, a broad, fertile plain, cut by a geometric grid of channels, engineered to tame the flow of water and multiply the harvest. There is an image of a culture that understands hydraulics, that can turn nature's pulse into food and trade and ease. Ships crowd the harbors, markets brim with goods from far coasts. The Navy is strong enough to make the sea feel like a road, and the road feel like a possession. If you close your eyes, you can hear the creak of rope, the slap of tide against hulls, the overlapping voices of merchants counting bales and amphorae. In this gentle bedtime quiet, the scenes take on a soft focus clarity, like moonlight on a tiled floor, and it is easier to see why Plato's audience would have leaned forward. He has made the far horizon glow. Yet he is careful to lace delight with doubt. The very abundance he describes becomes the seed of the decline he foretells. The temples grow richer in adornment, the feasts more lavish, the rulers more enamored of their own reflections. They begin to test the edges of their neighbors' patience, then their borders, then the borders of justice itself. Their eyes drift from stewardship to acquisition, from law to will. The war begins almost by accident of appetite. Against this hunger, he places an older Athens, a city of citizen soldiers whose wealth is not counted in metal, but in habit, not in ornament, but in order. To Plato's contemporaries, nursing the wounds of the Peloponnesian War and the memory of demagogues who traded the common good for applause, this would have felt like both balm and reprimand. He is not merely flattering the polis, he is reminding it who it could be. The structure of the dialogues underlines all this. Timaeus offers the cosmic frame, a universe fashioned by a divine craftsman according to reason, a world whose soul is harmonious and whose body is mathematically articulate. Within that ordered cosmos, human societies flourish or fail depending upon their alignment with reason, measure, and the good. Critias promises to zoom from cosmos to city, from principles to the case study of Athens and Atlantis. But Critias breaks off mid-tale, as if the scroll were torn, as if the sea itself had reached up and smudged the ink. The fragmentariness has been a gift to dreamers ever since. When a story ends abruptly, imagination rushes in like air into a vacuum, carrying theories and hopes and the faint perfume of maybe. Was the incompleteness deliberate, a way to keep the focus on the moral rather than the merely marvelous? Or was it simply the fate of a manuscript in a world where time eats paper the way the ocean eats shorelines? Plato leaves us with enough to keep us asking, which is, for a philosopher, a kind of victory. Even the genealogies carry quiet arguments. Poseidon is no random choice. The god of the sea and the earth-shaker, master of waves and earthquakes, fits a civilization that will be defined by its maritime power and undone by a convulsion of earth and water. Clito, the mortal mother, lives on a hill surrounded by rings of land and sea, a domestic picture that echoes through the monumental city plan her descendants later construct. 10 sons, 10 kingdoms, a council convened under divine eyes. Plato arranges these elements with the care of a dramatist and the purpose of a teacher. And all the while, under the glitter of orichalcum, runs the theme that wealth is safest when it is treated as a means rather than an end. You can feel the Athenian context humming beneath the text. This is a city that has known the intoxication of empire, the pride of fleets, the taste of tribute, and the bitterness of defeat. Plato's teacher Socrates had been executed by the city he tried to improve. The academy Plato founded was an act of faith that minds could be trained to prefer the good over the flattering. In that light, Atlantis looks less like a tantalizing mystery box and more like a carefully shaped parable. What we build with intelligence, we must maintain with virtue, or the very skills that raised the city will bury it. Still, even the sober reader is allowed a little wonder. The descriptions glitter with enough technicolor to invite speculation. Did orichalcum refer to an alloy like brass, or to orichalcum known to the ancients, or to something rarer, now lost, whose sheen seemed otherworldly to Greek eyes? Are the hot springs simply geology doing its timeless work, or a hint that the island sat on rest of earth? Are the canals plausible feats of Bronze Age engineering scaled up by Platonic grandeur, or flamboyant metaphors for balance and flow? Plato gives you just enough precision to keep your feet on the ground and just enough ambiguity to let your thoughts swim. He knows the pleasure of the threshold, that place where knowledge ends and imagination begins. The transmission chain he sketches, Egyptian priests to Solon, Solon to Dropides, Dropides to Critias the Elder, then to Critias the Younger, functions like a warranty for the story's antiquity, even as it admits the telephone game distortions that make myths supple. The Egyptians' assertion that catastrophes periodically erase Greek memory is also a narrative solvent. It dissolves objections with a shrug and a smile. Of course you have no records, child. Your cradle kept tipping into the fire. The rhetorical ease with which Plato moves between cosmic order and civic ethics, between genealogy and geology, helps explain why this legend refuses to drown. It is not presented as a mere marvel, it is anchored to a serious inquiry into how cities flourish and fail. That seriousness keeps the flights of fancy tethered. It also gives later ages permission to treat the story as a puzzle worthy of charts and compasses. If you have ever watched the ocean at dusk, how it looks like a sheet of hammered metal, then a field of tiny mirrors, then a soft, breathing animal, you know how the sea can turn certainty into mood. Plato uses that same transformation. He asks you to hold two thoughts at once, that Atlantis is an allegory illustrating the consequences of moral erosion, and that Atlantis might, in some lost ledger of the earth, have been a place whose stones felt sun and whose streets heard footsteps. The double exposure makes the image more vivid, not less. It is also why the legend passes so easily into the hands of poets, explorers, and, much later, filmmakers and divers with cameras that wink like curious fish. When Plato sketches the confrontation, virtuous Athens against acquisitive Atlantis, he is not writing propaganda for his city. He is writing a diagnosis that Athens itself needs to hear. The virtues he attributes to the old Athens are not self-congratulations, but prescriptions. Courage, moderation, wisdom, justice. The quartet that governs his republic reappears in the citizens who stand their ground without grasping for more than they can rightly hold. The victory he grants them is not muscular conquest, but moral steadiness. The defeat he assigns Atlantis is not a quirk of fate, but the result of character bent out of true. And then comes the sentence that reverberates down corridors of time. In a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the sea. No chorus, no cymbal crash, just the quiet solemnness of a verdict. If you listen closely, you can hear Plato's larger point in that hush. How swiftly unkept virtues can undo centuries of cleverness. How quickly the earth reminds us that we are tenants and not owners. He is too subtle to say it outright, but the implication is clear. The gods in Greek stories often stand in for the moral structure of the world. When Zeus convenes a council to judge, when Poseidon stirs the deep, the drama is theological and ethical at once. Divine retribution, in this sense, is the world's way of returning to balance. For a listener today, far from Plato's porticos, the beat of this old story is oddly familiar. We, too, live with the tension between what we can do and what we ought to do, between the seductions of scale and the obligations of measure. To return to the courtyard where we began, with the fountain's small voice and the afternoon light slanting across stone, you can see why the tale of Atlantis fits so snugly within a conversation about the best possible city. It is the shadow the ideal throws, the caution that completes the picture. Without it, the dream of justice would float away like a lantern cut loose from a boat at night. With it, the dream gains ballast. It rides the swell without capsizing. The origins of the legend, then, are not the shallow roots of a sailor's yarn, but the deep taproot of a philosophical meditation. Plato used the oldest tools, story, genealogy, the authority of foreign priests, the humility of an incomplete manuscript, to plant a question in soil that has proved very fertile indeed. Each age waters it in its own way, scholars with footnotes, explorers with charts, children with the simple, serious belief that somewhere, beyond the line where the horizon wears a ring of fire at sunset, sleeps a city that once sang with light. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sea opening before you, calm and silver in the morning light. Beyond the pillars of Heracles, further than most ancient ships dared to sail, there lies a vast island rising from the depths like a sleeping god's shoulder. This, Plato tells us, was Atlantis. Not a speck or a chain of small rocks, but a continent-sized landmass, larger than Libya and Asia combined, stretching wide with fertile plains, high mountains, and deep forests. It was not a barren rock, but a land so generous that its abundance seemed supernatural. Grain grew in double harvests, fruits ripened in heavy clusters, and rivers tumbled down from snow-capped peaks to feed valleys alive with green. Herds grazed across wide meadows. Elephants, yes, elephants, wandered the fields, their size and strength a sign of the island's vigor. The capital itself was a marvel beyond imagining. Imagine approaching from the sea. First the scent of salt and pine, then the gleam of walls catching sunlight as though the stone itself glowed. The city was built not haphazardly, as so many ancient towns were, but with an order that mirrored the harmony of the cosmos. Concentric circles of land and water radiated outward, each ring connected by bridges wide enough for chariots. Ships glided along the waterways as easily as carriages rattled across the stone spans. From above, it would have looked like a vast target painted on the earth. Each ring marked with towers, gardens, and colonnades, all pointing to the shining heart of the city. At that center stood the Acropolis, crowned by the Temple of Poseidon. Its walls were sheathed in silver, its pinnacles gleamed with gold, and inside it was a sight to leave mortals breathless. Ivory ceilings, walls inlaid with orichalcum glowing like living fire, statues of gods and nymphs, and in the very heart a colossal figure of Poseidon himself, astride 6 winged horses, his trident lifted high as though commanding the sea to obey. Around him swam 100 nereids, sea maidens riding dolphins, all cast in shining gold. Can you hear the clatter of sandals on marble as priests entered with offerings? Can you smell the incense rising into the vaulted air, mingling with the salt carried on ocean breezes? The material orichalcum remains one of the great mysteries. Plato describes it as fiery, gleaming, more precious than all but gold. Some think it may have been a form of copper alloy, perhaps similar to brass. Others imagine something stranger, a metal unknown to us, perhaps even a conductor of energy, giving rise to later legends of Atlantean technology far ahead of its time. Whatever it was, in Plato's vision, it turned walls and columns into radiant beacons, so that the whole city seemed to pulse with light, like a living organism illuminated from within. The harbor was no less impressive. Vast basins dug into the island sheltered fleets of ships, larger and more numerous than any other power of the ancient world. Quays lined with stone bustled with traders. Warehouses overflowed with goods, grain, metals, timber, exotic animals brought from conquered territories. The sea was not a barrier, but a highway, and Atlantis ruled it absolutely. One could imagine the smell of pitch and tar, the sound of ropes creaking, sails flapping, and hammers ringing as shipwrights shaped new vessels from timber harvested in the rich forests inland. The navy was not only the pride of Atlantis, but the instrument of its influence, carrying both trade and conquest across the seas. And yet, the marvels of engineering rivaled even the splendor of the harbors. Plato describes channels cut through the plain with mathematical precision, crisscrossing the land to irrigate fields and ease transport. Each canal was wide enough for ships to pass, fed by rivers flowing from mountains to sea. At regular intervals, bridges spanned the waters, lined with towers and gates, turning the city into a pattern of geometry and grandeur. Fresh water poured into baths, both public and private. Hot and cold springs channeled by aqueducts into pools where citizens could refresh themselves after debate, labor, or ceremony. Imagine the sound of cascading water echoing through courtyards, the laughter of children splashing in basins, the hum of life in a city that seemed to blend nature and architecture into one harmonious whole. Housing for citizens was not drab or crude. Buildings gleamed with white stone quarried nearby, painted with colors that have long since faded from our memory. Roofs might have been tiled in bronze or adorned with bright mosaics. Streets were broad enough for carts and lined with colonnades to shade pedestrians from the sun. Markets buzzed with merchants, stalls overflowing with olives, grapes, fish, fabrics dyed in deep blues and reds. Artisans worked in bronze, gold, and orichalcum, crafting jewelry, tools, and ornamentation that reflected both wealth and skill. In the evenings, perhaps music floated from courtyards, lyres and flutes weaving melodies as families dined on bread, fish, fruits, and meats drawn from the bounty of their fields and seas. The society itself was structured but not cruel, at least in its early days. 10 kings, each descended from Poseidon and Plato, ruled different regions of the island. Atlas, the eldest, held supremacy, his name echoing in the very word Atlantis. These rulers met regularly in the temple of Poseidon, where laws inscribed on the orichalcum pillar reminded them of their duty. Justice, moderation, and reverence for the divine were their guiding lights. Citizens, too, shared in the prosperity. Farmers tilled the fertile plain. Miners drew wealth from mountains rich in copper, gold, silver, and orichalcum. Artisans shaped beauty with their hands, and soldiers ensured peace both within and beyond the borders. This was not a city of slaves groaning under the lash, but of a people uplifted by abundance and order, at least in the Golden Age. The natural world of Atlantis was as much a wonder as its city. Great mountains rose along one edge, protecting the plain from harsh winds. Forests stretched for miles, full of timber strong enough for shipbuilding. Rivers teemed with fish, valleys with herds. And the climate itself seemed a gift of Poseidon, mild, balanced, never too harsh, yielding crops in generous cycles. You might imagine a spring morning in Atlantis, dew shining on wheat, the scent of flowering orchards drifting over fields, ships setting out with white sails flashing like wings against the horizon. Philosophers often dream of societies where material wealth does not corrupt but supports virtue. Atlantis, in its early days, seemed to embody that dream. Abundance was not hoarded but shared. Citizens enjoyed both beauty and security. Religious ceremonies honored Poseidon and the gods, reinforcing a sense of humility and balance. And at the heart of the city, the Temple of Poseidon reminded everyone of their divine heritage, a golden anchor tying human ambition to celestial order. But even as we imagine this shining city, we hear the whisper of caution beneath Plato's words. For the very abundance, the very order and brilliance that made Atlantis so enviable, also carried within it the seeds of pride. The gleam of orichalcum could dazzle, the wealth of the plains could tempt, the power of the fleet could intoxicate. A society that began with harmony risked tipping into hubris. And history, as Plato knew, is always waiting to show how easily light turns into shadow. Still, let us linger a moment longer in their golden age. Walk with me through a sunlit street of Atlantis. On your left rises a colonnade where scholars debate the movements of stars, their words echoing against marble. On your right, artisans hammer bronze into delicate shapes, while children chase one another between market stalls. Ahead, a canal glitters, boats gliding beneath bridges adorned with carvings of dolphins. The air smells of roasted grain, salt, and sweet fruit. Somewhere, a priest calls worshippers to a ceremony at Poseidon's temple, where torches burn and chants rise like waves. Above it all, the statue of Poseidon looms, serene yet watchful, as though he knows how fragile even the greatest civilizations can be. And as night falls, lanterns lit with oils glow along the streets. Music drifts from courtyards, laughter rises from gatherings, and the city breathes like a living organism, content and radiant. For now, it is a paradise. For now, it is the dream of humanity realized in stone, water, and light. And yet, as we will soon see, dreams have a way of dissolving. The shining order of Atlantis, like all golden ages, carried within it the faint shadow of decline. Picture Atlantis not as a fleeting vision, but as a fully realized society at its peak. The golden age of this island civilization was not merely a time of glittering temples and powerful fleets. It was an age defined by balance, harmony, and the delicate weaving of human life with the rhythms of the cosmos. To understand its glory, let us linger among the citizens themselves, for it is not marble or orichalcum alone that makes a city shine, but the lives lived within its walls. The Atlanteans, according to Plato's account, began with hearts tempered by divine blood. Their rulers were not tyrants, but guardians. 10 kings governed the island's regions, each entrusted with land, people, and resources, yet bound by sacred law and fraternity. When they met in the temple of Poseidon, they swore oaths upon the shining pillar of orichalcum, cutting the throats of bulls in ritual sacrifice, mingling blood with wine, and pledging themselves to justice. In those moments, the clang of ambition was softened by the gravity of the divine. They remembered their lineage, and remembering kept them steady. For the ordinary citizen, life was marked by abundance, but not decadence. Farmers woke with the sun, plowing fields made fertile by ingenious irrigation channels. They grew barley, wheat, olives, and grapes, and in their markets, loaves of bread and amphorae of wine changed hands as easily as greetings. Shepherds drove flocks across green hills, while fishermen cast nets into seas so generous that boats returned heavy with catch. To walk through the agora of Atlantis would have been to see a society where scarcity was nearly forgotten, and with it much of the bitterness that haunts poorer lands. Education was not a privilege of the few. Children learned letters, numbers, and the stories of gods and heroes, not as idle tales, but as moral compasses. They were trained in music and gymnastics, their bodies and minds balanced like the strings of a lyre. A youth of Atlantis might spend mornings studying geometry, afternoons wrestling in the palestra, and evenings listening to elders recount the laws of Poseidon and the victories of their ancestors. Wisdom was not divorced from play, nor strength from thought. Philosophy, too, thrived. In courtyards shaded by vines, teachers asked their students what it meant to live well, to act justly, to measure desire against duty. These conversations echoed the same questions Socrates would ask in Athens centuries later. In Atlantis, the pursuit of knowledge was not cloistered in ivory towers, but woven into the fabric of civic life. To speak of the stars, the soul, or the order of the world was as natural as to speak of harvests or ships. The cosmos itself seemed to whisper lessons to those willing to listen, that circles, balance, and harmony were the foundation of both geometry and justice. Religion provided more than ritual. It offered a sense of place. To the Atlanteans, Poseidon was not a distant figure, but a living presence, his trident stirring seas and quelling earthquakes. Offerings of bulls, fruits, and incense bound the people to their god, reminding them that prosperity was a gift, not a possession. At festivals, music and dance filled the air, flames leapt into the night, and voices rose in chorus. These were not orgies of excess, but celebrations of gratitude, affirmations that their abundance was sustained by reverence. The architecture of Atlantis reflected this harmony. Temples gleamed with gold and ivory, but they were not isolated monuments of pride. They were centers of community, places where law, worship, and civic identity intertwined. Homes, though handsome, were not palaces of vanity. Even the great palace of Atlas, the eldest king, was designed more as a symbol of guardianship than of luxury. Its walls encircled gardens, courts, and halls where governance was practiced with solemnity. Atlantean builders knew that stone, water, and wood could be shaped into more than comfort. They could embody ideals. At sea, Atlantis reigned supreme. Its navy, vast and disciplined, was not yet a weapon of conquest, but a shield of peace. Merchant vessels carried goods across waters to distant shores, spreading not fear but prosperity. Traders returned with stories of foreign lands, strange spices, and curious customs. Atlantis, at its height, was not merely insular, but outward-looking, confident enough to engage without the insecurity of domination. Foreign envoys marveled at the sight of concentric harbors bustling with activity, their eyes wide as they stepped into markets overflowing with goods. Many left with both admiration and envy. Yet the true glory of Atlantis lay not only in wealth or power, but in virtue. Citizens, nurtured by abundance, practiced moderation. Laws were respected not because punishments were harsh, but because justice was understood as the order of life itself. A man who cheated his neighbor in trade did not merely break a contract, he disrupted the harmony of the cosmos. Dishonor carried a weight heavier than legal penalties. To live well was to live in alignment with both law and nature, a philosophy echoed in their very city plan of circles and flowing channels. Even leisure reflected balance. Music was everywhere. Lyres strummed at feasts, flutes played at rituals, choirs sung at festivals. Theater performances retold myths with grandeur, reminding citizens of both triumphs and warnings. Athletic games honored strength and endurance, yet they were never divorced from the moral reminder that a strong body must house a disciplined soul. Families gathered in courtyards to eat, laugh, and share stories. Children played near fountains, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves. The city breathed with a rhythm that felt almost divine. Imagine an Atlantean festival night. Torches line the canals, their light dancing on water. Boats glide slowly, their prows decorated with flowers. Priests chant hymns to Poseidon, while citizens join in chorus. Tables overflow with bread, roasted meats, fruits, and wine. Musicians play, dancers sway, and children dart between legs with giggles. From the temple rises the smell of burning incense, drifting into the sky, as though carrying prayers to the gods. For a moment, the city seems to transcend time itself, a harmony of stone, water, flame, and voice, all woven into a single fabric of joy. Foreign visitors might have thought themselves in paradise. Indeed, to later ages, Atlantis would come to symbolize the unreachable dream of a perfect society. But for those who lived there, it was simply life, ordered, abundant, joyful, secure. A farmer knew his crops would grow. A sailor trusted the harbors to welcome him home. A child expected both play and education. The gods seemed near, justice seemed natural, and peace seemed enduring. And yet, history teaches us that perfection is always temporary. Plato reminds us, even as he paints this luminous picture, that the Atlanteans' divine heritage diminished over time. Mortals are not gods, and the weight of wealth, power, and ease presses hard upon the human spirit. The Atlanteans' golden age was real, but it was also fragile. Its brilliance makes its later fall all the more tragic. For now, though, let us stay in their glory. Let us walk their avenues, stand beneath the glittering temple, and listen to the hum of a society at peace with itself. Let us taste their bread, sip their wine, and hear the laughter of their children. Atlantis, in this age, was the very picture of harmony. The sun set upon its marble and orichalcum, the stars mirrored in its canals, and its people slept knowing their world was both secure and sacred. This was the Atlantis that captured Plato's imagination, a civilization balanced between the divine and the human, radiant in virtue, serene in abundance, and unaware that the tide of fate was already turning beneath its foundations. Every golden age carries within it the quiet pulse of decline, as if abundance itself contains a hidden seed of ruin. For Atlantis, that seed was planted in its prosperity. In the earliest generations, the divine blood of Poseidon flowed strong through its rulers, tempering their ambitions with reverence. But as centuries passed, the mortal strain thickened, the memory of their godly heritage dimmed, and the Atlanteans began to forget. Forgetfulness, Plato reminds us, is the beginning of corruption. And so it was that a society built upon harmony began to tilt toward hubris. At first, the changes were subtle. The kings, once austere in judgment, began to delight in display. The orichalcum pillars of Poseidon's temple, once symbols of law, became mirrors in which rulers admired their own reflections. Feasts grew longer, more lavish. What had been gatherings of gratitude became spectacles of excess, where banquets lasted for days and wine flowed without measure. Citizens who had once prized moderation now measured their worth by the glitter of their ornaments and the size of their estates. The navy, once a shield of peace, began to hunger for conquest. Ambassadors who had returned from foreign lands speaking of mutual trade were now followed by generals mapping routes of invasion. The harbors that had once welcomed visitors with open arms now bristled with fleets prepared to intimidate. Trade became tribute, and tribute became domination. The Atlanteans, who had once been admired as allies, were now feared as overlords. Their neighbors, once partners, now whispered in dread of their ambition. In the plain of Atlantis, fields still yielded double harvests, forests still rang with birdsong, and the canals still shimmered like silver threads. But beneath that abundance, a new spirit grew. Farmers were taxed more heavily, artisans pressed into producing not tools of beauty, but weapons of war. Wealth pooled not in the agora, but in the coffers of kings. The balance that had once defined their society tilted toward the greed of the few. And when the scales of justice tilt, the harmony of a city trembles. Religion, too, suffered. Temples still burned incense, sacrifices still spilled blood, but worship became less about reverence and more about display. Gold dripped from statues, not as offerings of devotion, but as boasts of wealth. Poseidon's image, once a reminder of humility before the sea, became a banner under which rulers cloaked their ambitions. They spoke his name not to honor, but to justify. When men use gods as excuses for conquest, the gods grow silent or wrathful. Imagine the mood of the city now. The streets still glitter, but the laughter has changed. Where once neighbors shared food, now they whisper suspicions. Where once a handshake sealed trust, now contracts are weighed against the threat of soldiers. The music of flutes and lyres still drifts from courtyards, but beneath it lies a tension, a sense that the harmony has gone slightly out of tune. Children still play in fountains, but their parents glance nervously toward the horizon, where fleets depart not for trade, but for war. Plato's warning grows sharper here. He tells us that when men forget virtue, their desires swell beyond measure. The Atlanteans began to desire not only goods, but lands, not only influence, but dominion. They marched across seas, subjugating islands and coastal nations. Their armies spread like wildfire, consuming territory until they stood at the doorstep of Athens itself. Their ambition had become boundless, and boundless ambition, unchecked by justice, is the surest path to destruction. In the councils of kings, debates grew harsher. No longer did rulers meet in quiet reverence around Poseidon's pillar, swearing oaths to keep their laws. Instead, the voices rose in clamor. Who should lead the next campaign? Who should reap the greatest share of spoils? How best to break those who resisted? The pillar of orichalcum still stood, shining in the torchlight, but its inscriptions were no longer remembered. Words engraved in metal mean little when they are not engraved in hearts. The city itself bore the marks of change. The markets, once vibrant with goods of every land, now grew anxious and grim. Prices soared, wealth concentrated, luxuries became symbols of superiority rather than common abundance. A necklace of gold no longer celebrated craftsmanship, but declared status. A banquet no longer honored gods, but boasted of power. The very architecture seemed to strain under the weight of pride. Columns carved taller, not for beauty, but for intimidation. Statues erected less as offerings than as monuments to vanity. And yet, decline is never absolute at first. There must have been those who remembered, who mourned the loss of moderation. Imagine an old farmer watching soldiers march past, shaking his head at how the grain once grown for neighbors now feeds armies destined for conquest. Imagine a priest kneeling in the temple, incense curling upward, whispering prayers to Poseidon not for victory but for forgiveness. Imagine a mother telling her child stories of the Golden Age, when laughter rang clearer, when neighbors trusted one another, when kings still feared the gods. These voices, though quiet, must have existed. But they were drowned by the louder clamor of ambition. Plato's allegory is sharp here. He writes not only of Atlantis, but of Athens, of all cities that rise to greatness and then fall prey to their own pride. The lesson is universal. When justice is forgotten, prosperity becomes poison. Wealth without virtue is not strength, but weakness disguised in gold. Power without humility is not order, but chaos wearing armor. The Atlanteans forgot this, and their forgetting sealed their fate. The natural world itself seemed to sense the change. Earthquakes rattled the mountains more often. Storms rolled across the seas with fiercer winds, and the fertile plains sometimes yielded less than before. These signs may have been read as omens, warnings from Poseidon that the balance was breaking. But the kings, deafened by ambition, did not listen. Hubris blinds as surely as darkness. It is easy, even comforting, to imagine Atlantis as a lost paradise destroyed by fate. But Plato does not let us rest there. He insists that Atlantis was destroyed not by accident, but by character. Its people chose ambition over moderation, vanity over reverence, domination over justice. Their fall was not tragedy in the Greek sense of blind misfortune. It was moral consequence. They built their ruin with their own hands, stone by gleaming stone. So when we picture Atlantis at this stage, let us not imagine ruins beneath the waves just yet. Let us imagine a city still shining, still magnificent, but hollow at the core. A palace with golden walls but rotting beams. A harbor filled with ships, their sails proud but their purpose poisoned. A temple still rich in ivory and gold, but echoing with prayers that rise no higher than the ceiling.
That is the true image of Atlantis before the end, brilliant on the surface, broken within. And it is precisely because their greatness was so bright that their fall would be so devastating. A simple village may vanish with little notice, but when an empire falls, the echo shakes the world. Atlantis, once the envy of all nations, now carried within it the weight of inevitable collapse. The gods, watching from Olympus, must have whispered to one another that the reckoning was near. And Poseidon himself, once father and protector, must have looked upon his children with sorrow. For when the divine is forgotten, even the sea cannot save. The ancients believed that the gods watched over human affairs not as distant spectators, but as participants, guardians, and sometimes executioners. When societies flourished in justice, the gods smiled upon them. When arrogance festered and hubris swelled, the gods corrected with force. Atlantis, in its prime, had been a child of Poseidon, born of divine passion and nurtured by the bounty of sea and earth. But when its people turned from humility to pride, the divine inheritance grew thin, and the eyes of Olympus turned stern. Plato describes this moment with a solemn weight. The Atlanteans had extended their dominion across many islands and lands, their fleets darkening seas, their armies trampling coastlines. Their ambition had grown so unbridled that they set their sights upon Athens itself, determined to bend it beneath their empire. This was the tipping point, the final straw that transformed mere excess into defiance of cosmic order. For the Greeks, Athens symbolized the guardian of liberty, the city that valued virtue above wealth. To attack it was to attack the very principle of justice. The gods, who had once blessed Atlantis, now convened to pass judgment.
Picture the council of the gods on Olympus. The air is thin, the sky clear, lightning flickering at the edges of Zeus's throne. The 12 Olympians assemble, their voices a rumble of thunder and wind. Poseidon, sea-born and earth-shaker, stands with trident in hand, his expression torn between pride in his once noble children and sorrow at their corruption. He had loved them, given them land, walls, metals, springs, and abundance. He had walked among them in the early days, guiding their kings and consecrating their laws. Now he watched them twist his gifts into weapons of conquest, their temples into monuments of vanity. What father would not feel both grief and anger? Zeus, king of the gods, rises. His eyes, they say, flash brighter than the sun when he is wrathful. He looks across the council and speaks not with the rage of passion, but with the calm weight of inevitability. The world must be set right. The balance must be restored. He speaks of Atlantis, once divine, now corrupted, once harmonious, now unjust, once humble, now swollen with arrogance. His words, though ancient, carry the same gravity we feel today when societies forget moderation, when they believe themselves invincible. In this divine courtroom there is no appeal. The gods do not send envoys, do not write warnings, do not negotiate terms. Their judgment is swift and absolute. Atlantis will be punished, not as individuals, but as a whole. The civilization itself has become diseased, and the only cure is destruction. Yet let us pause and feel the tragedy of this verdict. For not all Atlanteans were corrupt. Surely some still prayed with sincerity, still lived with moderation, still remembered the old laws. But history and myth alike remind us that when a society tips into hubris, even the innocent are swept along. The flood does not choose its victims. The earthquake does not separate the virtuous from the proud. In this way, the judgment of the gods is both just and merciless, a reminder that collective destiny is bound together. Imagine Poseidon's silence in that council. Did he argue for mercy? Did he remind the gods of the nobility of his children's beginnings?
Or did he, with heavy heart, bow his head and accept that even he could not protect those who had forgotten him? The myths do not say. They leave us with the image of Zeus, thunder in his voice, declaring that Atlantis will be struck down. The sea, which had been their highway and protector, would become their grave. The earth, which had nourished their fields, would tremble and swallow them. In a single day and night of misfortune, Atlantis would vanish beneath the waves. The symbolism is stark. Earthquakes and floods, Poseidon's dual powers, would erase what pride had built. The punishment fit the crime. A people who had forgotten moderation would learn the ultimate lesson: impermanence. Their walls of orichalcum, their fleets of warships, their temples dripping with gold, all would be no more enduring than foam on the sea. What remains when pride is punished is silence, a void where voices once sang. Let us imagine that final night, not yet in ruin, but in foreboding. The city still gleams, torches lining the canals, music floating across the waters. But beneath the laughter lies unease. The ground trembles faintly, dishes rattle on tables, animals grow restless. Priests in Poseidon's temple cast fearful glances at the sacred pillar, as if the god's eyes have turned away.
The sea laps higher against the quays, waves strangely insistent. Farmers returning from the plain whisper of fissures opening in fields, of springs turning muddy, of birds flying in chaotic flocks. The people sense that something has shifted, though few can name it. Above them, unseen, the gods have already passed their sentence. The machinery of fate has begun to move. The sea is no longer a mirror, but a weapon. The earth beneath their feet is no longer foundation, but enemy. And the stars above, once silent witnesses of their festivals, now gleam cold and distant. This is the stillness before the storm, the breath before the blow. Atlantis stands tall, but its shadow has already begun to stretch. Plato does not embellish with details of divine quarrels or heroic last stands. He gives us only the solemn verdict: the gods destroyed Atlantis, and it sank beneath the sea. But imagination fills the gaps. We can hear Zeus's thunder rolling across Olympus, Poseidon's trident striking the ocean floor, the ground shattering, waves towering. The gods act not with malice, but with inevitability. The punishment is not cruel for cruelty's sake. It is the restoration of balance, the correction of hubris. For the Greeks, this was more than myth. It was philosophy clothed in story. Zeus represents the order of justice, Poseidon the raw forces of nature. Together, their judgment shows that no society, however wealthy or advanced, can defy measure without consequence. In Atlantis, we see a mirror of Athens, of any empire, of ourselves. It is a caution whispered through the ages. Do not forget moderation. Do not let wealth blind you. Do not confuse abundance with virtue. The council of the gods fades into silence, their verdict sealed. Far below, in the glittering harbors of Atlantis, the people dance, feast, and plan for conquest, unaware that their fate has already been decided. The waves gather strength in the dark, the earth stirs beneath its crust, and the gods wait for dawn to strike. Atlantis, proud and radiant, has been judged. Soon it will be undone. The story of Atlantis reaches its most haunting moment in the silence before the end. The gods had judged, the verdict had been pronounced, and now the sentence was carried out not by sword or spear, but by the forces of earth and sea themselves. Plato tells us simply, in a single day and night of misfortune, Atlantis disappeared beneath the waves. A short sentence, almost understated, but within it lies an entire world shattering in terror. To imagine it is to step into the last dawn of the greatest civilization the ancient world ever dreamed. The day began like any other. Farmers awoke to tend their fields. Merchants opened stalls in bustling markets. Priests prepared offerings in the temple of Poseidon. Children played in courtyards, their laughter ringing against stone walls. Ships raised sails, catching the morning wind, their prows cutting through the calm waters of the outer ring. The city glowed with life, unaware that it was living its final hours. Yet signs lingered in the edges of perception. Dogs barked without cause, horses stamped nervously in their stables, and fishermen reported strange currents, as if the sea itself was restless. Then came the tremors. At first they were small, no more than a shiver beneath the souls of citizens hurrying through streets. Cups rattled, amphorae tipped on shelves. Some muttered of bad omens, others shrugged, for earthquakes were not unknown in lands touched by Poseidon. But the tremors grew stronger, waves of motion rolling beneath the city like some vast beast turning in its sleep. Walls shook, plaster cracked, torches swung in sconces. Panic began to spread as the ground beneath temples and homes groaned, a deep sound like the roar of a wounded god. Imagine the harbor now. Sailors shout as ships strain against their moorings, the sea pulling with unnatural force. Water levels rise and fall in strange rhythm, retreating suddenly to reveal bare seabeds, then surging back with violence. The canals, once graceful ribbons connecting the city, overflow their banks, flooding streets. Citizens clutch children and flee to higher ground, though in a city built on concentric rings, there is little higher to reach. Bridges tremble, towers sway, statues topple with echoing crashes. The great golden figure of Poseidon himself, carved in ivory and orichalcum, shudders as if the god is alive and furious. Night falls, but not gently. Fires break out as lamps overturn, their flames spreading amid chaos. Smoke mingles with dust rising from collapsing buildings. The moon, pale above, flickers behind veils of ash. The earth does not rest, it convulses. Fissures open in the fertile plain, swallowing fields and herds. Springs that once ran clear now gush with mud, poisoning the baths and fountains. Citizens cry out to the gods, some rushing into temples with desperate prayers, others cursing the heavens for betrayal. But no divine hand lifts them. The gods have turned away. Their judgment is already in motion. And then the sea rises. At first it surges in waves, breaking over seawalls, sweeping carts and animals into its foam. But soon it becomes something else entirely. A wall of water, higher than any man has seen, rushes toward the city with a roar that drowns every cry. This is the tsunami, the sea unchained, the trident of Poseidon striking with merciless force. Ships are lifted like toys and dashed against stone. Bridges vanish beneath torrents. Citizens clutch each other as waves tear through streets, sweeping bodies, animals, and rubble alike into the chaos. In the plain beyond the city, devastation is no less. Irrigation channels, once symbols of engineering genius, now funnel destruction. Floodwaters race through furrows, uprooting crops, drowning villages. Herds of cattle and elephants are carried away, their bellows lost in the roar of water. Farmers who once praised the abundance of their land now scramble for survival, dragged into the current. The earth itself continues to shake, mountains splitting, rivers changing course, the very map of Atlantis rewritten in an instant. Back in the capital, the temple of Poseidon faces its final moment. Priests cling to the sacred pillar, their chants drowned by the thunder of collapsing stone. Statues shatter, golden nereids tumble into floods, ivory ceilings crash down. And at last, even Poseidon's towering image tilts and falls, breaking apart as waves smash through the sanctuary. It is not the god who falls, but the pride of his children. His silence is louder than any storm. The night stretches long, filled with terror. Families huddle together on rooftops, watching waters rise inexorably. Some attempt to flee by boat, only to be overturned in boiling seas. Others climb hillsides, only to see those hills crumble into the ocean. There is no escape. The sea comes from every side. The earth collapses from beneath. Atlantis, once a jewel rising from the waves, is now being dragged back into the element from which it was born. And then, silence. The morning dawns, but the city is gone. Where marble walls once glowed, there is only the gleam of water. Where canals once carried boats, only endless sea. Where markets buzzed, where children played, where kings judged, there is nothing but ripples and foam. The island has sunk, the civilization erased, the memory left to echo only in stories. Atlantis has vanished. For Plato's audience, this image was as chilling as it was instructive. The mightiest of empires, destroyed not over centuries, but in a single day and night. No siege, no slow decline, but sudden annihilation. It was the perfect parable. Wealth without virtue crumbles not gradually, but catastrophically. Hubris does not fade, it explodes. Atlantis, in this sense, was not only a lost city, but a moral warning carved into myth. To later generations, the sinking of Atlantis would inspire endless imagination. Was it an earthquake, a tsunami, a volcanic eruption? Did the sea swallow it whole, or did it crumble beneath its own weight? Each theory tries to explain what Plato leaves stark and simple. But in the power of his brevity lies the enduring magic. By saying only that it vanished in one day and night, he leaves us to fill the silence with our own fear, awe, and fascination. Picture the ocean centuries later. Fishermen sail over calm waters, unaware of the ruins lying beneath. Waves sparkle under the sun, concealing the silence of temples buried in silt, statues broken, canals filled with sand. The world moves on, but the sea remembers. Somewhere in its depths lie the bones of Atlantis, hidden from human eyes, yet never forgotten by human imagination. Atlantis is gone, but in its absence it becomes eternal. For destruction, paradoxically, preserves the legend. A city that endured might have become ordinary. A city erased becomes immortal. And so, the tragedy of Atlantis is also the seed of its myth. It drowned, but it did not die. It continues to live in words, in dreams, in the restless whisper of the sea against the shore. The story of Atlantis does not stand alone in the world's memory. Across continents and centuries, civilizations have preserved tales of a great flood, a deluge that wiped away cities, kingdoms, or even all of humanity, leaving only a remnant to begin anew. These myths, scattered like fragments of a broken mirror, reflect the same image: water rising, worlds ending, lessons being carved into the very bones of humanity. To place Atlantis among them is to see it not as an isolated legend, but as part of a chorus, a universal memory of catastrophe and rebirth. The Greeks themselves were no strangers to flood myths. Long before Plato wrote of Atlantis, poets spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the couple who survived when Zeus sent a deluge to cleanse humanity of its corruption. Warned by Prometheus, Deucalion built a chest, a kind of ancient ark, and floated for 9 days and nights before coming to rest on Mount Parnassus. From there, he and Pyrrha cast stones behind them, which became men and women, repopulating the earth. The resemblance to the later story of Noah is unmistakable. Humanity judged, a flood unleashed, a righteous remnant preserved. To Plato's audience, the destruction of Atlantis by flood and earthquake would have echoed this older tale, reinforcing the idea that the gods punish hubris not with subtlety, but with overwhelming waters. Travel east to Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, and you find another great flood etched into clay tablets. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written 1,000 years before Plato, tells of Utnapishtim, warned by the god Ea to build a boat because the other gods had decreed humanity's destruction. He filled it with family, craftsmen, and animals of every kind. The flood came, covering mountains, annihilating cities. For 7 days and nights, the storm raged until the boat came to rest on Mount Nasir. A dove and a raven were sent to test the waters, and when the flood receded, Utnapishtim offered sacrifice, and the gods regretted their rashness. The parallels to both Noah and Deucalion are clear, but they also resonate with Atlantis. Here again is the theme: a society destroyed for arrogance, a cataclysm by water, and the preservation of a lesson for survivors. In the Hebrew Bible, the story of Noah forms one of the central myths of judgment and salvation. The world had grown corrupt, filled with violence, and God, grieved at heart, resolved to wipe it clean. Noah, righteous among his generation, built an ark at God's command. The rains fell for 40 days and nights, the fountains of the deep burst forth, and waters covered the earth. When the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, Noah released birds to test the land. And when at last the waters receded, God set a rainbow in the sky as covenant. This was not only a story of destruction, but of renewal, of promise after wrath. To those who heard Plato's account of Atlantis, the echo of Noah's flood would have been unmistakable. Water as judgment, water as erasure, water as memory. But the resonance of flood myths stretches far beyond the Mediterranean and the Near East. In India, the ancient texts tell of Manu, the primordial man, warned by a fish that a great flood was coming. The fish grew larger and larger until it revealed himself as the god Vishnu. Manu built a boat, and when the flood waters rose, the fish towed him to safety upon a mountaintop. From Manu, humanity was reborn. In this tale, as in others, water is both destroyer and preserver, sweeping away the old while carrying the seeds of the new. Among the indigenous peoples of the Americas, flood myths also abound. The Maya spoke of a great flood sent to wipe out an earlier race of wooden people who had forgotten the gods. In Aztec tradition, the world had ended multiple times, one of them through flood, with survivors transformed into fish. In Incan lore, 2 shepherds survived a deluge on a mountain while all others perished. In North America, many native tribes recount versions of a world drowned and renewed, from the Hopi to the Algonquin. The details vary, but the core remains. Water rises, life ends, and life begins again. Even in distant Polynesia, where the ocean itself is both cradle and threat, myths of great floods persist. Islands vanishing beneath waves, people surviving on rafts or mountaintops. These tales speak of an intimate knowledge of the sea's dual nature, provider and destroyer. The Pacific peoples, living so close to the rhythms of tide and storm, wove the memory of cataclysm into their stories like knots in their canoes' lashings. Why are these flood myths so universal? Partly because floods themselves are universal. Rivers overflow, storms surge, tsunamis strike. And for ancient peoples, these disasters were not just natural events, but cosmic lessons. Water, after all, is life itself. To see it rise in fury, sweeping away fields, homes, and temples, was to see life turned against itself, abundance transformed into annihilation. Such experiences leave marks not only on landscapes, but on collective memory, carried forward in story so that descendants would remember both the danger and the lesson. Plato's Atlantis fits into this pattern, but with a unique twist. Where many flood myths focus on humanity as a whole, Atlantis centers on a single civilization, one marked by extraordinary power and wealth. Its destruction, therefore, is not just the cleansing of the world, but the fall of an empire. This difference makes the story particularly potent, for it warns not merely individuals, but entire societies. No matter how advanced, no matter how mighty, if you forget virtue, the sea will claim you. There is another intriguing layer. Some scholars suggest that behind these myths lies memory of real events, rising sea levels after the Ice Age, tsunamis triggered by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions that shattered islands. Imagine coastal settlements drowned as glaciers melted, their memory preserved not in written records, but in the only medium available, story. Each culture, in its own tongue, shaped a same memory into myth. The waters rose and we survived, barely. Atlantis, then, may be not only allegory, but a poetic distillation of a collective trauma humanity has carried for thousands of years. Consider how Plato's phrase, "in a single day and night," mirrors the suddenness described in flood myths worldwide. The speed of catastrophe is central. There is no time to prepare, no chance to resist, only the overwhelming force of water. This immediacy etches itself deeply into cultural memory. The difference is that Plato places his catastrophe in a civilization of splendor, turning it into a mirror for his own Athens, a caution against pride. But the resonance with Noah, Gilgamesh, Manu, and Deucalion is unmistakable. Water is the great equalizer, indifferent to wealth, status, or power. Now imagine sitting by a fire in some ancient village, listening to elders tell of the time when the world was drowned. Outside, rain patters on the roof, and the sound of rivers rushing is never far away. The story is both warning and comfort. Warning that hubris invites destruction, comfort that survival is possible, that life can begin again. Atlantis adds another layer, that even the greatest empires are vulnerable, that the sea cares nothing for gold walls or shining temples. It swallows without distinction, and what remains is only memory. Perhaps that is why Atlantis has endured so powerfully in imagination. It is not only the story of a lost city. It is humanity's deepest fear and deepest truth dressed in splendor. We fear the sea's rising, we know its power, and we recognize in Atlantis our own reflection, brilliant, ambitious, fragile. Like all flood myths, it speaks to the fragility of our place in the cosmos, to the ease with which water can erase even our proudest achievements. And yet, in all these stories, there is also a thread of hope. Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the earth. Utnapishtim survives to tell his tale. Noah steps into a cleansed world beneath a rainbow. Manu begins humanity anew. Even in Atlantis, though the city sinks, the story survives, carried forward in Plato's dialogues, whispered through centuries, resurrected in art, literature, and imagination. The flood destroys, but memory endures. And through memory, perhaps, we are offered the chance to learn. When Plato first told the story of Atlantis, his listeners may have heard it as allegory, philosophy clothed in myth. But centuries later, as explorers crossed seas and scientists probed the earth, the tale began to stir a different question. Could there be truth behind the legend? Could Atlantis have been not only a parable, but a memory of real catastrophe? The sea, after all, conceals more than it reveals, and the earth itself carries scars of ancient violence. Let us now drift into the realm of science, where geology, archaeology, and history meet imagination, and ask, what might have destroyed Atlantis, if it ever lived? The most common explanation begins with the fury of the earth itself, volcanoes. Across history, volcanic eruptions have reshaped landscapes in moments, burying cities, darkening skies, and even altering climate. The most famous parallel is the eruption of Thera, now called Santorini, around 1600 before Christ. This Aegean island, home to a flourishing Minoan civilization, exploded with a violence so immense that it shattered the island, sent tsunamis across the Mediterranean, and rained ash as far as Egypt. Whole towns were buried beneath pumice and lava. The island's once perfect ring collapsed inward, leaving the caldera that still yawns today. For many, this is the most compelling candidate for Atlantis, a sophisticated island society, brilliant in architecture and art, annihilated in a single cataclysm of earth and sea. Plato may have heard echoes of this disaster through Egyptian records and wove them into his dialogue, exaggerating time and distance but preserving the core memory of sudden destruction. Volcanoes are not alone in their power. Earthquakes, too, haunt the Mediterranean. Greece itself lies on restless tectonic plates, where the African plate slides beneath the Eurasian, generating tremors that have toppled cities again and again. Imagine an ancient city built upon such unstable ground. In a single night, the earth could ripple like water, foundations split, buildings collapse. And if the quake struck near the coast, the sea would join the assault. Modern science calls it a tsunami. Ancient people called it the wrath of Poseidon. Waves, higher than temples, rushing inland with unstoppable force, sweeping away fields, homes, and harbors. Plato's phrase, "in a single day and night," fits such a chain of disaster perfectly. An earthquake followed by a tsunami, leaving nothing but ruins drowned beneath the waves. Beyond Greece, other possible candidates arise. The Azores, a volcanic archipelago in the Atlantic, lie roughly where Plato placed Atlantis, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, in the ocean itself. These islands sit atop the mid-Atlantic ridge, a place where tectonic plates diverge, where the Earth's crust is raw and unstable. Submerged plateaus nearby hint at lands that once rose higher. Could Atlantis have been a large island here, shattered by eruptions and swallowed by the sea? To imagine it is to picture mountains sinking while waves roar overhead, leaving only scattered peaks, the Azores themselves, behind. Some scientists point to sudden shifts at the end of the last ice age. Around 12,000 years ago, glaciers melted at astonishing speed. Sea levels rose by over 100 meters, drowning vast areas of coastal plain. Imagine villages, perhaps even cities, along these coasts, their people watching as the ocean crept higher each year, then surged in catastrophic pulses when ice dams burst. The Black Sea flood theory suggests that a sudden inundation transformed a freshwater lake into the saltwater sea we know today, overwhelming Neolithic settlements along its shores. Could Atlantis have been one such culture, erased by the relentless advance of water? If so, Plato's story might be less allegory than distant memory, passed down like a haunting refrain through generations until it reached his ears. Other, more speculative ideas have emerged. Some speak of methane hydrate eruptions, vast bubbles of trapped gas released from the seabed, destabilizing waters and creating sudden sinkings. Others imagine asteroid impacts, though evidence is scant. Still others see Atlantis not in one place, but as a composite memory, fragments of many disasters, Thera, tsunamis, rising seas, woven together into one story. Myths, after all, are not always lies. They are often mosaics of truth, arranged by memory into patterns that make sense to the human heart. Let us linger on Thera, for it remains the most vivid candidate. The Minoans, contemporaries of Egypt's pharaohs, built palaces with plumbing, art alive with dolphins, and fleets that dominated the Aegean. When the volcano erupted, it was one of the largest explosions in human history. Entire towns vanished beneath pumice. Tsunamis rolled across Crete, devastating ports. The economy crumbled, and though the Minoans survived for a time, their decline opened the way for Mycenaean Greeks to rise. Imagine being a survivor of that eruption, the ground trembling, the sky blackening, the sea rising in walls of foam. Would not your children's children remember? Would they not whisper of a great island destroying by fire and water, a paradise lost in a single night? And if those whispers reached Egypt, preserved in temple records, could they not be the seed of Plato's tale? Yet even if Atlantis was never Santorini, the resonance remains. Science tells us that disasters of unimaginable scale have struck again and again. Tsunamis have wiped out coastlines in Japan, Indonesia, and Chile. Volcanoes like Krakatoa and Tambora have darkened skies and chilled summers across the globe.
Entire cities, Pompeii, Herculaneum, have vanished in hours beneath ash. The earth is both cradle and executioner, and Plato's Atlantis captures this truth in mythic form. The ground we trust is never still. The sea we sail is never tame. To live on earth is to live on borrowed stability. Some argue that Atlantis was never meant to be taken literally at all, that Plato invented it whole, a parable of hubris. But even then, the fact that it feels plausible matters. Myths endure not because they are fanciful, but because they resonate with what we know to be true. We know cities fall. We know seas rise. We know pride comes before ruin. Atlantis endures because it feels possible, even inevitable. And science, in its study of volcanoes, earthquakes, and floods, only deepens that resonance, reminding us that destruction can be swift and merciless. So, where does that leave us? Perhaps Atlantis was Santorini. Perhaps it was the Azores. Perhaps it was a memory of Ice Age floods. Or perhaps it was only Plato's moral tale. But science shows us that the destruction he describes is not fantasy. Civilizations can vanish in days. Lands can sink. Seas can rise. What he imagined as philosophy, the earth has enacted again and again. The line between myth and geology is thinner than we think. And so, when we look out over the ocean today, it is tempting to imagine what lies beneath. Are there ruins, temples, streets covered in silt, silent beneath waves? Or is Atlantis less a place than a warning, written in water and stone? Either way, the lesson is the same. The earth is restless, the sea is patient, and civilizations that forget their fragility may one day join Atlantis in silence.
The story of Atlantis might have remained only in the pages of Plato's dialogues if not for one restless feature of human nature, the desire to find what is lost. For more than 2,000 years, men and women have looked at the horizon and wondered if the ruins of Atlantis lie just beyond sight. Some have searched with scholarly rigor, others with wild imagination, but all have been driven by the same question: what if the legend is true? The sea is vast, but curiosity is patient, and generation after generation has tried to pierce its mysteries. Perhaps the most famous theory anchors Atlantis to Santorini, or ancient Thera, the Aegean island shattered by volcanic eruption around 1600 before Christ. Archaeologists uncovered the city of Akrotiri, preserved beneath ash like a prehistoric Pompeii. Streets lined with multi-story houses, frescoes alive with dolphins, women gathering saffron, men steering ships. It was a civilization of elegance and sophistication, frozen in time. When the eruption came, it buried the city in pumice and rock, and tsunamis lashed across Crete, crippling the Minoan Empire. Could this be Atlantis? The parallels are striking, and advanced maritime culture, destroyed in a single cataclysm of earth and sea, its memory carried into legend. Yet there are differences. Thera was not larger than Libya and Asia combined, as Plato claimed, and it lies within the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Still, many believe that Plato may have woven this real disaster into his story, amplifying it into a mythic scale. Further west, the Azores have captured imaginations. These islands, rising from the mid-Atlantic, are volcanic peaks thrust above the waves. For centuries, sailors whispered of landmasses seen and lost, of islands that appeared on maps only to vanish again. Some argue that the Azores are the surviving mountaintops of a larger island that once stretched across the ocean. Their position, roughly where Plato placed Atlantis, beyond the pillars, gives weight to the theory. Beneath the waves, explorers have claimed to find submerged plateaus, seamounts, and rock formations that hint at lands once dry. Though geology suggests these plateaus sank millions of years ago, long before humans, the dream persists. Perhaps Atlantis sleeps beneath the Atlantic swells, hidden in deep trenches where only submarines dare to go. In the waters of the Bahamas, another tantalizing clue emerged in 1968. Divers near Bimini Island stumbled upon a strange formation. Long rows of massive stone blocks laid out like a road or seawall, stretching into the distance beneath shallow water. Called the Bimini Road, it quickly drew speculation. Was this a harbor, a dock, a remnant of Atlantis itself? Or was it, as geologists argue, a natural formation of beach rock fractured into neat lines by natural processes? To some, the stones are too regular, too deliberate. To others, they are simply nature's illusion. Yet the legend endures, fueled by the fact that Plato himself described Atlantis as lying in the Atlantic, and here in the Bahamas is a structure beneath the waves that looks like the bones of a lost city. The Mediterranean holds other candidates. Off the coast of Spain, near Cadiz, ruins have been claimed beneath marshlands, suggesting an ancient port drowned by rising seas. In southern Spain's Doñana National Park, satellite images revealed circular formations reminiscent of Plato's concentric rings. Some archaeologists believe this could be Tartessos, an ancient culture known to the Greeks, whose memory blended into the story of Atlantis. Excavations have uncovered artifacts, but definitive proof remains elusive. Still, the pattern of circles in swampy earth sparks imagination. Could this be the ghost of Atlantis, preserved in mud instead of myth? Egypt, too, enters the story. In the Nile Delta, beneath waters and silt, the ruins of Heracleion and Canopus were discovered, great port cities once thought legendary. For centuries they were myths, and then divers swam through their streets, brushing silt from statues of gods and kings. If Heracleion could be found after vanishing for 1,000 years, why not Atlantis after 9,000? Each discovery of a drowned city makes Plato's tale feel a little less impossible. And then there are the dreamers who look beyond archaeology to imagination. In the 19th century, Ignatius Donnelly wrote Atlantis, the antediluvian world, claiming that Atlantis was the mother civilization of all others, the source of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas. His book ignited fascination, convincing many that Atlantis was not myth but history. Later, mystics like Helena Blavatsky and Edgar Cayce spoke of Atlantis in spiritual terms, describing crystal technologies and psychic powers, turning the lost island into a beacon of esoteric wisdom. Scientists scoff, yet the public imagination was captivated, and the legend grew ever larger. Modern technology has only intensified the hunt. Satellites scan coastlines, submarines crawl along seabeds, sonar maps trenches once invisible. Off Cuba, strange geometric shapes have been reported deep underwater, though data remains scarce. In the Caribbean, divers search among reefs, while in the Mediterranean, archaeologists sift through ruins seeking patterns that match Plato's descriptions. The search has become not only scholarly but romantic, an eternal treasure hunt where each discovery of an ancient ruin fuels the belief that Atlantis must be next. And yet, with each candidate comes the same problem: certainty slips away. The Bimini Road may be natural rock. The Azores may be volcanic peaks too young to host a Bronze Age empire. Santorini may be too small, Spain too shallow, Cuba too speculative. Atlantis retreats like a mirage. The closer you think you are, the further it seems. But perhaps this is why it endures. If Atlantis were found tomorrow, mapped and catalogued, it would cease to be mystery and become history. The fact that it evades certainty makes it immortal. Still, imagine being one of those explorers, diving into deep blue water, light fading, pressure mounting. Ahead, in the beam of your torch, shapes emerge. Stones squared and laid in rows, columns toppled and half buried, statues staring from the silt. Your heart quickens. Have you found it? Are you touching the bones of Atlantis at last? Whether real or illusion, the thrill is undeniable. Atlantis lives not only in ruins, but in the beating hearts of those who search. The search for Atlantis reveals more about us than about the city itself. It shows our longing for origins, our hunger to believe in lost golden ages, our fear that greatness can vanish in an instant. Every submerged ruin discovered, whether in Greece, Egypt, India, or the Americas, whispers that Atlantis might yet be real. And so long as the sea keeps its secrets, so long will divers, scholars, and dreamers continue to chase them. Atlantis may be the greatest treasure never found, but in the searching, humanity finds something else, a reflection of our own desire to link myth with memory, to find in the deep not only ruins, but meaning. Atlantis, once the solemn warning of a philosopher, did not remain confined to Plato's dialogues.
Over centuries, it transformed, reshaped by mystics, writers, artists, and filmmakers into something larger than history, a symbol, a canvas upon which humanity projected dreams of lost wisdom and hidden power. If Plato's Atlantis was a mirror for Athens, later generations turned it into a mirror for their own hopes, fears, and fantasies. In this way, Atlantis became not just a story, but a cultural phenomenon. The 19th century marked a turning point. Until then, Atlantis was mostly the province of scholars, debating whether Plato had meant allegory or history. But in 1882, an American congressman named Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. His book electrified the public. Donnelly argued that Atlantis was not a fable, but the cradle of all civilizations, a mighty culture that seeded Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even the Americas before vanishing. He claimed that myths of gods and heroes were memories of Atlantean kings, that technologies like writing and metallurgy had flowed from the lost island. Though scholars dismissed his theories as speculative, the book was wildly popular, selling thousands of copies and inspiring generations to think of Atlantis as a real, tangible mother civilization. Donnelly transformed Atlantis from a philosopher's parable into a cultural obsession. Mysticism soon followed. Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society, folded Atlantis into her vast tapestry of esoteric teachings. She spoke of ancient root races, of spiritual evolution, of Atlanteans wielding psychic powers and crystal technologies far beyond modern science. To her followers, Atlantis was not merely history, but prophecy, a lost chapter of human destiny whose lessons could guide spiritual seekers in the present. These ideas, though far from Plato's sober warnings, gave Atlantis new life in an age hungry for mystical wisdom.
In the early 20th century, another voice added fuel to the fire: Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. In trance, Cayce claimed to access the Akashic records, a cosmic memory of all human history. Again and again, he spoke of Atlantis, describing it as a highly advanced civilization with flying machines, energy crystals, and technologies capable of harnessing the Earth's forces.
According to Casey, Atlantis had been destroyed not once, but in stages, culminating in its final sinking around 10,000 years ago. He predicted that remnants of Atlantis would rise again near the Bahamas, particularly around Bimini, a prophecy that lent dramatic weight to the discovery of the Bimini Road in 1968. For Casey's followers, Atlantis was not myth but destiny, a key to understanding both our past and our future. Popular culture eagerly embraced these visions. In pulp magazines and novels of the early 20th century, Atlantis became the setting for tales of adventure, mystery, and lost technology. Writers like Jules Verne hinted at it, while others placed heroes among its ruins or imagined Atlanteans surviving in hidden refuges. By the mid-century, comic books brought Atlantis into new mythologies. In DC Comics, Aquaman ruled its underwater kingdom. In Marvel Comics, Namor the Submariner emerged from its depths. Here, Atlantis was no longer a moral parable, but a stage for superheroes, a fantastical realm blending myth and modern imagination. Cinema, too, could not resist the lure. Films from the silent era to modern blockbusters have portrayed Atlantis in countless forms. A glittering utopia sunk by disaster, a decadent empire undone by arrogance, a futuristic society with technologies we still cannot fathom. Disney's animated film Atlantis: The Lost Empire painted it as a kingdom of glowing crystals and ancient wisdom. Other films have imagined Atlantean survivors guiding humanity in secret, their lost city waiting to be rediscovered beneath the waves. Each retelling shapes Atlantis anew, reflecting the desires of its age. In times of optimism, it becomes a paradise. In times of anxiety, a warning. Video games carried Atlantis into interactive realms. In titles like Tomb Raider, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and countless fantasy adventures, Atlantis appears as a place to be explored, its ruins filled with secrets, puzzles, and powers. Players dive beneath digital seas, swim through flooded halls, uncover glowing artifacts, and battle guardians of forgotten technology. In these stories, Atlantis is not merely an allegory. It is a treasure chest, waiting to be opened by those brave enough to seek it. But why does Atlantis thrive so strongly in popular imagination? Perhaps because it sits at the crossroads of two powerful longings, the yearning for a golden age and the thrill of catastrophe. On one hand, it promises a utopia, a society of abundance, wisdom, and beauty, lost only because of human failing. On the other, it satisfies our fascination with disaster, the drama of collapse, the spectacle of nature overwhelming pride. Atlantis gives us both paradise and apocalypse, hope and warning. It says, "Once there was a world better than ours, and it was destroyed. Could it happen again? Could we be next?" In spiritual movements, Atlantis continues to hold sway. New Age teachings often describe it as a civilization of high vibration, where humans lived in harmony with cosmic energies until corruption led to downfall. Crystals, meditation practices, and even theories of extraterrestrial contact are woven into these Atlantean myths. For believers, Atlantis is less about ruins beneath the sea and more about memory in the soul. To remember Atlantis is to awaken to wisdom long forgotten, to reconnect with a higher destiny. In literature, Atlantis appears everywhere, from science fiction to fantasy, from serious novels to children's books. Writers use it as metaphor for lost knowledge, for human arrogance, for the fragility of civilization. Sometimes it is a cautionary tale, sometimes a beacon of hope, sometimes simply an exotic backdrop for adventure. The flexibility of the myth is its greatest strength. Like water, it takes the shape of whatever vessel holds it: philosophy, mysticism, art, entertainment. What is striking is how far Atlantis has drifted from Plato's original purpose. For him, it was an allegory, a story to warn Athens of the dangers of pride and the importance of virtue. Today, it is everything from superhero kingdom to mystical prophecy to video game dungeon. And yet, beneath all these layers, the original resonance remains. Atlantis continues to remind us of both our potential and our peril. It whispers of civilizations rising high and falling suddenly, of wisdom lost and sought again, of the eternal dance between light and hubris. So whether you encounter Atlantis in a dusty old book, a glowing cinema screen, or the shimmering pixels of a game, you are touching the same current that began with Plato 2,000 years ago. It is a current of imagination as deep and inexhaustible as the sea itself. Atlantis may never be found in stone, but it has been found in story, in art, in the dreams of humanity. And in that sense, it is more real than any ruin, because it lives wherever minds dare to wonder what lies beneath the waves. As we arrive at the end of our journey through the legend of Atlantis, it becomes clear that this story has never been only about the past. Whether or not Atlantis ever stood upon the earth, its meaning has always reached forward into the present and the future. Plato gave us not just a tale of cataclysm, but a meditation on the human condition, one that still whispers urgently to us across the centuries. For what he described in Atlantis, the slow drift from virtue to hubris, from harmony to greed, from balance to collapse, is not a unique fate. It is the pattern that has haunted civilizations again and again, and it still lingers over us now. At the heart of Plato's lesson is the Greek concept of hubris, the overreaching pride that blinds men and nations alike. The Atlanteans began with divine blood, but as it thinned, so did their humility. They forgot the sacred laws, turned temples into ornaments, fleets into weapons, and wealth into a measure of worth. Their hubris summoned their fall, and their fall was sudden, complete, and irreversible. In this way, Atlantis becomes a timeless parable. It warns that no matter amount of power, technology, or abundance can save a society that forgets moderation. To rise too high without balance is to invite the sea. History, of course, echoes this lesson. The fall of Rome, the collapse of the Maya, the decline of countless empires all bear the same rhythm: growth, pride, overreach, collapse. The names and details change, but the pattern remains. Plato's Atlantis is not just one story among many. It is a symbol of them all, distilled into a single, unforgettable image. A city shining with gold one day, swallowed by the ocean the next.
It is not only history that vanishes in an instant, but memory itself, unless carried forward in story. For us today, Atlantis holds another layer of urgency. We live in an age where technology and abundance rival any golden age imagined by Plato. Our cities gleam with towers of glass, our ships cross seas in hours, our voices leap across the globe at the speed of light. We command energies and resources undreamed of by the ancients. And yet, like Atlantis, we walk the edge between harmony and hubris. The warnings are everywhere. The climate shifts, seas rise, forests fall, and the earth beneath us trembles under the weight of our ambition. Plato's phrase, "in a single day and night," reminds us that catastrophe can come swiftly. The earth is patient, but when balance is broken, its answer can be sudden and merciless. The environmental resonance of Atlantis is perhaps the most striking for us now. Imagine a society so advanced, so abundant, that it believed itself untouchable, only to be undone by the very forces it had taken for granted. The sea that fed them drowned them. The earth that steadied them swallowed them. Is this not the same danger we face when we treat oceans, rivers, skies, and forests as endless resources rather than fragile gifts? Atlantis warns that nature is not conquered, it is partnered, and if that partnership is broken, the reckoning will come. But there is also hope in this myth. If Atlantis shows us the danger of forgetting, it also shows the power of memory. Plato told this story not to frighten, but to teach, not to extinguish hope, but to shape it. He wanted Athens, and by extension all of us, to remember that justice, moderation, and reverence are not luxuries, but necessities. A city that lives by them may endure. A city that forgets them will fall, no matter its wealth or armies. Atlantis perished, but its lessons survived, carried through story, waiting for ears willing to listen. The ethical thread of Atlantis runs deep. It reminds us that civilizations are judged not by their monuments, but by their character. Golden walls mean nothing if the people within are corrupt. Armies mean nothing if justice is forgotten. Technology means nothing if wisdom is lost. To build a society worthy of endurance, we must anchor it not in power but in virtue, not in pride but in humility, not in greed but in stewardship. Atlantis failed not because it lacked brilliance, but because it lacked balance. That is the simplest and deepest lesson of all. In modern times, we see Atlantis reflected in more than just empires. It speaks to corporations that grow vast and collapse under their own excess, to governments that rise promising justice but crumble in corruption, to individuals who mistake wealth for worth. It speaks to climate crises, political arrogance, and cultural amnesia. Each time we forget the limits of our place in the world, we risk becoming Atlantis. Each time we confuse abundance with immortality, we step closer to the waves. Yet Atlantis is not only a warning, it is also an invitation. It asks us to imagine what a golden age could be, not in the past, but in the present. The early Atlanteans lived in harmony, practiced moderation, honored their gods, and built beauty not for vanity, but for community. That vision is not lost to time. We can build societies that balance wealth with justice, power with humility, technology with stewardship.
The myth challenges us. If we envy Atlantis's golden age, can we also learn from its fall? Can we choose the path of moderation before the sea rises? Imagine standing on a shore at dusk, waves rolling in quietly, sky glowing with the last light of day. The ocean is calm, but you know its power. Beneath its surface lie ruins of countless forgotten cities, from Heracleion in Egypt to Pavlopetri in Greece, from Dwarka in India to entire coastlines drowned by Ice Age floods. The sea does not reveal all its secrets, but it keeps them. Atlantis may be among them, or it may be only in our minds. Either way, the lesson is the same. Civilizations are fragile, and the sea always waits. Plato's gift to us was not a map, but a mirror. Atlantis is not a place to be found, it is a story to be understood. It reflects our best and worst, our rise and our fall, our brilliance and our blindness. It is the reminder that even the greatest can be lost in a moment, but also that memory, story, and wisdom can endure if we choose to carry them. The question is not whether Atlantis existed. The question is whether we are repeating its fate. So, as you close your eyes tonight, let the waves of this story wash over you. Hear the laughter of Atlantean children in their courtyards, the music of flutes in moonlit festivals, the roar of the sea as it rises to claim the city. Feel the weight of hubris, the swiftness of catastrophe, the silence of the sea when all is gone. And then let it turn into a whisper. Live with balance. Remember your fragility. Honor the world that sustains you. For Atlantis is not gone. It lives wherever humans choose pride over humility, greed over justice. And it lives too wherever we choose to learn. The sea waits, but so does wisdom.